released, the courtroom rapidly emptied. The man to whom Mrs. Touchet had so hungered to speak was just now stepping out into Parliament Square. And from there, if she did not boldly step into his path, he would escape her grasp, float off to some corner of the city she could not know or imagine and would never be able to reach. Mr. Bogle, I'm so sorry to accost you in this manner, but my name is Mrs. Touchet, and I would very much like to take you to tea. This chapter is called Andrew and Henry and Eliza. She had imagined this encounter, pictured herself accosting father and son just like this outside the court, and then the walk down Great George Street to a chop house, the corner table by the window, even what she would say as the arthritic Mr. Bogle slowly took his seat. But nowhere in these mental projections had she imagined being asked to explain herself. No more than she expected the figures in her dreams to stop what they were doing and ask their sleeping author why they flew in a hot air balloon or visited China, dined with the Queen. It is surely not a difficult question, Mrs. Touchet. Mrs. Touchet. My father has had a very long and trying day. I consider it my duty to protect him from any further exertions. I'll ask again, what is it that you want with my father? He did not say my father. Had no hint of that Caribbean lilt she'd expected and heard at various lecterns over the years, and for a moment this threw her. And nor was this young Master Bogle like those musical voices of memory pleading his case. On the contrary, it was Eliza who now found herself pleading. Well, I only wish to speak with him, but perhaps he might answer for himself, Mr. Bogle. The elder Bogle put out a steady hand to still his excitable son. Madam, I have spoken and I have not been believed. I think I have now finished speaking. So Roger is ruined, and if he is ruined, how much more ruined am I? No. Now I will go home. Come, Henry. But Mr. Bogle, I believe you. And saying it aloud, she realized it was true. He looked at her narrowly. He'd been holding his top hat in his hands, now he sighed and put it back on his head. Well, it is of no consequence now. On the contrary, Mr. Bogle, there is to be a criminal case, in which no doubt your testimony will prove consequential, particularly given that the public interest in your situation is at present so lively. Henry frowned. You are a journalist, then? I? Well, no. I am a writer, improvised Mrs. Touchet, colour flooding her cheeks. She had hoped not to stumble into a direct lie. But something about the shrewd, dissecting gaze of the son pushed her onwards. That is to say, I write occasional pieces for a periodical, Bentley's. And I feel certain our readers would be very curious to hear more of your father's story. I see. And what would it pay? Pay? I'm sorry, I don't understand. Mrs. Touchet, with all due respect, if my father has something that is of value to you, then it is only fair that he should be paid for his trouble. We've been told that these London papers sell twice as fast on the days when my father's testimony appears, and yet so far, we've seen no advantage from it whatsoever. Mrs. Touchet struggled to hide her disappointment at this open display of venality. She clutched her bag a little tighter in her hands. Mr. Bogle, I'm afraid I cannot pay for interviews. As far as I'm aware, it's not common practice. A private look now passed between the Bogles that she did her best to read. Offence, hunger, pride. But if there is some other way in which I might be of assistance, perhaps, well, I wonder whether you and your father might not join me for a good hot meal. You must be in need of sustenance after such a long and trying day. Had she gone too far? She could see with what defensive care the son was dressed. Kept his gloved fingers tucked into his palm to hide the holes. Wore a stopped brass pocket watch in his threadbare waistcoat. His shoes were of the kind found in the pawn shops, serially resold and in 3 different shades of brown leather. Perhaps he was 16. The two of them stepped back from her for a moment and consulted, and it seemed that Henry's counsel would win out. But then the father put a hand to his son's wrist once more and stepped forward. I will come. My son will walk with us as far as Regent Street. He must go to Sir Roger. He will be needed there. But I will come with you and eat. This chapter is called A Public Spectacle. The walk was not long, but never in her life had she experienced anything like it. The Lady Godiva could not have attracted more attention. At the coffee stalls, queues of people turned to stare, and a dozen heads whipped round on the omnibus. Taxi drivers revolved on their boxes to examine from behind what had already been scrutinised from the front. Some recognised Bogle and cried out his name. "Oi, Bogle! We believe you, Bogle! Send our regards to Sir Roger!" But most mistook the three of them for a family of some kind, a not unknown sight in the slums, so Liza imagined, but surely rarely to be seen promenading through town. Being English, most commentary was quiet, poisonous, patient. She strained to hear it, but could never catch it distinctly. She'd always passed half a yard in front before the speaker began. But children, having fewer scruples, laughed openly, and could be heard asking each other what happened if you gave an Ethiop a bath, or how such woolly hair might feel in your hand, advising each other on defence against cannibals. It would have been Mrs. Touché's inclination to fill the air with chatter, but neither Bogle nor his son said a word. They walked in silence until they reached a likely chop house, through the window of which Mrs. Touché could see at least one respectable-looking woman dining. Here Henry took his leave of them, and a startled doorman led the party of two to a booth behind a pillar, far from any natural light. "Mrs. Touché, I have repeated over and over all that I have to say and all that I know of the matter. I've spoken to the gentlemen of the press and in the courtroom. What else can I say that I have not said?" Mrs. Touché looked at the table. It was for some reason very difficult to look into his eyes. "With respect, Mr. Bogle, I think it would interest people very much to learn how you came to be in such an unusual situation. Your whole history would be of interest, far beyond the narrow scope of what we've heard in the courtroom. What was your life in New South Wales, for example, or in Jamaica? We learned very little of our Caribbean possessions since the terrible trade ended." "Alas, Mrs. Touché, that trade is also a part of my history." He spoke distantly, looking past her towards the kitchens. A set of pewter candlesticks sat between them. He picked one up, weighing it in his hands. "Do you suppose they serve pork chops here?" "They are famous for their chops, Mr. Bogle," murmured Mrs. Touché, and was quiet for a moment. Had she ever gone without a meal, even once, in her whole life? "Well, I am fond of chops." "Then we will have them. Mr. Bogle, do you think you might like to tell me something of your story? I mean, tell me something of your life?" Mr. Bogle sighed, put down the candlestick, and seemed to come back to the table, back to the present moment from a place far away. "Life is a long business, Mrs. Touché. What should I tell you of my life?" She almost reached a hand across the table. "Tell me everything," I said.